Thus, the best penalty often promotes the way to use violence and make society safer. Yet in such document human rights abuses, Amnesty International has done nothing to make society safer. In fact, homicide rate in states with the death penalty are no lower than homicide rate in states that do not maintain the death penalty. The death penalty is unjustly applied on every level, racially, socio-economically, and even geographically. In fact, and people can. Death sentence in Philadelphia found the practice was unlikely to receive the death penalty, although others were convicted of some crime. Meanwhile, over 80% of people executed since 1976 were convicted of killing whites, while the people of Kerala make up more than half of the victims in the United States. In addition, 98% of all prisoners sentenced to death could not fill their own attorney. The reality is that regardless of the nature of crime, a defendant who can forget or harm an attorney is much less likely to be sentenced to die. Needless to say, the death penalty is often promoted as a way to reduce violence and make society safer. Yet, in several years documenting human rights abuses, Amnesty International has found the death penalty does nothing to make society safer. In fact, homicide rates in states with the death penalty are no longer the considered do not make the death penalty. The death penalty is unjustly applied on every level, racially, socio-economically, and even geographically. In fact, imposition of the death penalty is so little with the class and race barriers that in actuality it is used almost exclusively in poor and people of color. A 1998 study of death sentences in Philadelphia found that black defendants were almost four times more likely to receive the death penalty than others who committed similar crimes. Meanwhile, over 80% of people executed since 1976 were convicted of killing whites, although people of Kerala make up more than half of homicide victims in the United States. In addition, 98% of all prisoners sentenced to death could not fulfill their autonomy. The reality is that regardless of the nature of the crime, defendant who can fulfill his or her own autonomy is much less likely to be sentenced to die. In the United States, the death penalty is often promoted as a death reduces violence, makes society safer. Yet in research documenting human rights abuses, Amnesty International has found that death penalty does nothing to make it safer. In fact, homicide rates in states with the death penalty are no longer the homicide rates in states that do not make it a death penalty. The death penalty is unjustly applied on every level, racially, socio-economically, and even geographically. In fact, imposition of the death penalty is so little with a class or race barrier that in actuality it is used almost exclusively on the poor and people of color. A 1998 study of death sentences in Philadelphia found that black defendants were almost four times more likely to receive the death penalty than others who committed similar crimes. Meanwhile, over 80% of people executed since 1976 were convicted of killing whites, although people of color make up more than half of all homicide victims in the United States. Additionally, 80% of all persons sentenced to death could not afford their own attorney. The reality is that regardless of the nature of the crime, a defendant who can afford his or her own attorney is much less likely to be sentenced to die. In the United States, the death penalty is often promoted as a way to reduce violence and make society safer. Yet, in its 35 years of documenting human rights abuses, Amnesty International has found that the death penalty has nothing to make safe so far. Homicide with the death penalty are no longer than homicide rates in the do not maintain the death penalty. The death penalty is unjustly applied on every level, racially, socio-economically, and even geographically. In fact, uh, so little is characterized by us, so that actually it is used almost exclusively on the poor and people of color. A 1998 study that sentence in Philadelphia found that black defendants were almost four times the rate of death penalty than were others who committed similar crimes. Meanwhile, over 80% of people executed since 1976 were convicted of killing whites, although people of color make up more than half of the victims in the United States. In addition, 90% of all persons sentenced to death could not afford their own attorney. The reality is that regardless of the nature of the crime, a defendant who can afford his or her own attorney is much less likely to be sentenced to die. In the United States, the death penalty is often promoted as a way to reduce violence and make society safer. Yet, in its study for the documenting human rights abuses, Amnesty International found that death does nothing make society safer. In fact, homicide rates in states with the death penalty are no lower than homicide rates in states that do not maintain the death penalty. The death penalty is unjustly applied on every level, racially, socio-economically, and even geographically. In fact, the imposition of the death penalty is so little with a class and race bias that in actuality it is used almost exclusively on the poor and the people of color. A 1998 study of death sentences in Philadelphia found that black defendants were almost four times more likely to death penalty. Meanwhile, over 80% of people executed since 1976 were convicted of killing whites, although people of color make up more than half homicide victims in the United States. In addition, 98% of all persons sentenced to death could not afford their own attorney. The reality is that regardless of the nature of the crime, the defendant, who can afford his or her own attorney, is much less likely to be sentenced to die. In the United States, the death penalty is often promoted as a way to reduce violence and make society safer. Yet in documenting human rights abuses, Amnesty International has found that the death penalty does nothing to make society safer. In fact, homicide rates with the death penalty are no longer than homicide rates in the death penalty is unjustly applied on every level, racially, socio-economically, and even geographically. In fact, imposition of death penalty is so little with class and race bias that in actuality it is useful exclusively on the poor and people of color. A 1998 study of death sentences in Philadelphia your crimes. Meanwhile, over 80% of people executed since 1970 are convicted killing rights. Although people of color make up homicide victims in the United States. In addition, 90–80% of all persons sentenced to death could not afford their attorney. The reality is that regardless of the nature of the crime, a defendant who can afford his or her own attorney is much less likely to be sentenced to die. Sentenced to die. In the United States, the death penalty is often promoted as a way to reduce violence and make society safer. Yet, in the United States, the death penalty is often promoted as a way to reduce violence and make society safer. Yet, in its 35 years, yet in its Yet in 35 years of documenting human rights abuse, yet in its 35 years of documenting human rights, yet in its 35 years, yet in its 35 years of documenting human rights, the death penalty is often promoted as a way to reduce violence and make society safer. Yet in its, yet its, yet in its a study, and a study, and in a study, and in its study, and a study five. Ah, it's fine now. And it's 35, and it's 35, 35, and it's 35 years. Unblocked as a way to reduce violence and make society safer. Yang is 35 years of documenting human rights abuses. Amnesty International has found that the death penalty ちょっとやりましょうか。Amnesty International death penalty safer. In fact, homicide rates in states with the death penalty are no lower than homicide rates in states with the death penalty. Uh, yeah, to say the death penalty often promoted as a way to balance, make society safer. Yet in 35 years of documenting human rights abuses, Amnesty International has found that the death penalty does nothing to make society safer. In fact, homicide rates uh, homs- in fact, homicide rate in documenting human rights abuses, Amnesty International has found that the death penalty does nothing to make society safer. In fact, homicide rates in states with the death penalty are no lower than homicide rates in states documenting human rights abuses. Amnesty International does nothing to make society safer. In fact, homicide rates in states with the death penalty are no lower than homicide rates in states that do not make the death penalty. The death penalty is just applied on every level, racially, socio-economically, and even geographically. In fact, imposition of death penalty is so little with class and race bias that in actuality it is used almost exclusively on the poor and people of color. A 1998 study of death sentences in Philadelphia found that black defendants were almost 4 times likely to receive the death penalty than others who committed serious crimes. Meanwhile, over 80% of people executed since 1976 were convicted of killing whites, although people of color make up more than half of all homicide victims in the United States. In addition, 80% of all persons sentenced to death could not afford their own attorney. The reality is that regardless of the nature of crime, defendant who can afford his or her own attorney is much less likely to be sentenced to die. Uh, 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 uh. Uh, uh, mm.これhomicide っつってんだけど。In fact, homicide rate in states. homicide 愛なんだね、これ。homicide. 違う。いいか。homicide. homicide. homicide. はい。うん。 Hmm. 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 General orders. General order. Hmm? General orders. General orders frequently criminal crimes. Amnesty International has found the death penalty does nothing to make society safer. In fact, homicide rates in states with the death penalty are no lower than homicide rates in states that do not maintain the death penalty. The death penalty is unjustly applied on every level, racially, socio-economically, and even geographically. In fact, imposition of the death penalty is so little with the class of race bias that in actuality it is used almost exclusively on the poor and the people of color. Sentenced to die, sentenced to die. In the United States, the death penalty is often touted as a way to reduce violence and make society safer. Yet, in 30 years of documenting human rights abuses, Amnesty International has found that the death penalty does nothing to make society safer. In fact, homicide rates in states with the death penalty are lower than homicide rates in states that do not maintain the death penalty. The death penalty is unjustly applied on every level, racially, socio-economically, and even geographically. In fact, the imposition of the death penalty is so little with the class and race bias that in actuality it is used almost exclusively on the poor and the people of color. A 1998 study of death sentences in Philadelphia found that black defendants were almost 4 times more likely to receive the death penalty than were others who committed similar crimes. Meanwhile, over 80% of people executed since 1976 were convicted of killing whites. Although people of color make up more than half of all homicide victims in the United States. In addition, an 80% of sentenced to death could not afford their own attorney. The reality is that regardless of the nature of the crime, a defendant who can afford his or her own attorney is much less likely to be to die. Sentenced to die. Sentenced to die. Hmm. A defendant who can prove his or her own attorney is much less likely to be sentenced to die. Much less likely to die. 極めて可能性が低い。be sentenced to die 死刑を宣告される。あ In the United States, the death penalty is often promoted as a way to reduce violence and make society safer. Yet, in 35 years of documenting human rights abuses, Amnesty International has found that the death penalty does nothing to make society safer. In fact, homicide rates in states with the death penalty are no lower than homicide rates in states that do not maintain the death penalty. The death penalty is unjustly applied on every level, racially, socio-economically, and even geographically. In fact, imposition of the death penalty is so little with a class-less bias that in actuality it is used almost exclusively on the poor and people of color. A 1998 study of death sentences in Philadelphia found that black defendants were almost four times more likely to receive the death penalty than were others who committed similar crimes. Meanwhile, over 80% of people executed since 1976 were convicted of killing whites. Although people of color make up more than half of the victims in the United States. In addition, 98% of all prisoners sentenced to death could not afford their attorney. The reality is, regardless of the nature of the crime, a defendant who can afford his or her own attorney is much less likely to be sentenced to die. Uh, in the United States, the death penalty is often promoted as a way to reduce violence and make society safer. Yet in 30 years of documenting human rights abuses, Amnesty International has found that death penalty does nothing to make society safer. In fact, homicide rates in states with the death penalty are lower than homicide rates in states that do not maintain the death penalty. The death penalty is unjustly applied on every level, racially, socio-economically, and even geographically. In fact, imposition of the death penalty is so little with a cross and race bias that in actuality it is used almost exclusively on the poor and the people of color. In 1998, Vietnams were almost four times more likely to receive the death penalty than were others who committed similar crimes. Meanwhile, over 80% of people executed since 1976 were convicted of killing whites, although people of color make up more than half of all homicide victims in the United States. In addition, 98% of all persons sentenced to death could not afford their own attorney. The reality is that regardless of the nature of the crime, the defendant who can afford his or her own attorney is much less likely to be sentenced to die. Hmm. In the United States, the death penalty is often promoted as a way to reduce violence and make society safer. Yet, in its 30 years of documenting human rights abuses, Amnesty International has found that the death penalty does nothing to make society safer. In fact, homicide rates in states with the death penalty are no lower than homicide rates in states that do not maintain the death penalty. The death penalty is unjust applied on every level, racially, socio-economically, and even geographically. In fact, imposition of the death penalty is so little with class and race bias that in actuality it is used almost exclusively on the poor, or even class bias. In actuality, it is used almost exclusively on the poor and people of color. A 1998 study 耳がpeople of color. A 1998 study of death sentences in Philadelphia found that black defendants were almost four times more likely to receive the death penalty than others who committed criminal crimes. Meanwhile, over 80% of people executed since 1976 were convicted of killing whites, although people of color make up more than half of all homicide victims in the United States. In addition, 98% of all persons sentenced to death could not afford their own attorney. The reality is that regardless of the nature of crime, a defendant who can afford his or her own attorney is much less likely to be sentenced to die. Hmm. Socioeconomically and even geographically. In fact, imposition of the death penalty is so little with the class and race barriers that in actuality it is used almost exclusively on the poor and the people of color. A 1998 study of death sentences in Philadelphia found that black defendants were almost four times more likely to receive the death penalty than were others who committed similar crimes. Meanwhile, over 80% of people executed since 1976 were convicted of killing whites, although people of color make up more than half of all homicide victims in the United States. In addition, 98% of all persons sentenced to death could not find the attorney. The reality is that regardless of the nature of the crime, a defendant who can afford his or her own attorney is much less likely to be sentenced to die.